Hello and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Wednesday, and this is the part of our show where we get to sit down and talk about different ways to bring back the magic and also the pleasure of reading and self-education into your life. And today we got a very special episode, and of course today's episode is brought to you by all of my generous subscribers and also really intelligent subscribers, because recently I put out a post on my community section, or like the community wall section, where I basically said, hey guys, just ask me some pressing questions that you might have about reading and see if I can conjure something up to alleviate these pain points. So I got 17 questions, which is insane. And I said to the video, or I said to whatever, I said on the thread, I'm going to answer all of them. But man, some of these questions, within the questions, there are also 3 other questions. So we got like a kind of like a cluster question situation going on. So I'm not really sure how many of them I can work through. I'm going to try my best. And also I just recover from a horrible illness. Not really horrible illness, but I lost my voice 2 days ago due to feeling sick. And this is the first day where I'm able to hop on a mic and a camera to record a video. So let's hope this one goes through, and let's hope I can answer as many of them before my voice starts cracking like a teenager again. So anyway, let us get started. So first one is from Dimitra Procheska. If I completely butchered that name right there, I'm so sorry. But this question says, is there a reason why I can read mostly non-fiction books and not fiction? It's hard for me to form an image in my head when reading. Do you have any advice on how to get better at that? Or is it just something you have or don't have? In my experience, I have the same problem as you. That's why I don't read a lot of fiction nowadays. I can get into fiction, and I would also acknowledge that, yes, fiction reading is a lot harder than non-fiction reading. If you think of reading as a pyramid, so the bottom shelf of the pyramid, you kind of have like web optimized writing. The kind of stuff that you read on Threads or Instagram, or the kind of stuff that you read in YouTube descriptions, that kind of stuff is designed for you to read. And that stuff is a lot easier to get through because it's optimized for you to spend as little time as possible to read it. But then as you advance upwards, you got nonfiction, you got like complicated nonfiction like philosophy and history books, and you got specialized nonfiction where like it's like medical journals or something. And I would situate fiction near the top of the pyramid, because in fiction, you're not only dealing with language, because let's be frank here, a lot of the nonfiction that you're going to read, the voice typically conforms to how we think in our heads. But in the case of fiction, the point of fiction is kind of for you to train up this way of thinking about the world that involves new colors, new expressions, and new ways of thinking about the world. So it is going to be challenging, depending on the kind of level of fiction that you want to read. Maybe Dan Brown's a lot easier to conjure up images in your head, but something like literature, if you go ahead and read Virginia Woolf or God Save Us, James Joyce, you're going to have a lot more of those linguistical battles in your head. Yes, the images are harder to form because that's what literature's supposed to do. It's supposed to cultivate empathy. It's supposed to get new thoughts and new feelings and new ideas into your head. And yes, you can get better at it by practicing it. And this is a large part of what reading fiction is for. It trains up this magical thing called empathy. So over time, the more you imagine what life is like from a completely different era, or from a completely different frame of mind, the more you can expand how you experience the world. And yes, it's supposed to be a little bit harder, and it is something that you can definitely train up, and it is something, it's not really something that you're born with. And of course, some people, they've had the rare privilege of reading a lot as a kid, and that's how they were able to expand their imagination. But for people like us, we have to spend a lot more time practicing it, so it's fine. Practice it. It's supposed to be difficult. Fiction is supposed to introduce new feelings, new language, and new sensations in your head. There is nothing wrong with that. The next question is from Amusable Clementine with a cute little orange plushy icon. I have tried multiple times to run a book club, and it tends to fail because it seems to be an easy thing to cut compared to people's real priorities and their main ways of unwinding/relaxing. I even went for short stories and poems in my last attempt, and provided everyone with the materials/open access stuff, but I ended up ghosted. So did you ghost them or did they ghost you? I'm assuming they ghosted you anyway. Any ideas about how to be better leadership or how to be a better leader would be super helpful. I really would love to start something that gets off the ground. So yeah, I can't comment on starting a book club because I never started one. And in my poor attempt to start one, it's very hard. The last thing I did was kind of like a nonfiction writing workshop, and like 4 people turned up. So I know like it's really hard to get people to get time throughout the day to attend an event. But something that inspired me recently is Charlie something. I forget his name, but he runs a book club called Grandpa's Book Club here in Melbourne. What inspired me was particularly his pricing structure, where he kind of intentionally set the price high for the book club. So it was like something like $65 just to turn up to a space and talk about books. It's a very nice space, but you think to yourself, dude, $65, that's like 3 Japanese bento lunches. But paradoxically, the turnout was fantastic. There was like 30 people there, all very enthusiastic. So I think people are finicky creatures, and we tend to behave in these really counterintuitive ways. Sometimes, if you make it too easy for people are actually not going to want it. But you have to make your value proposition as, yes, you need to believe that this book club is very valuable. And you have to believe that, and then you have to set up certain barriers for people to get through in order for them to value your book club. So what I'm seeing here is, yes, you keep reducing the length of your material. So people can either choose, reading short stuff with a bunch of people they don't really care about, or just staying at home watching Netflix. Now, there's not a great incentive to go out there and socialize, especially if you're dealing with readers who are notorious introverts. So I would even say just work on what kind of value you're providing and really believe in it, and set up a higher barrier of entry. Because paradoxically, people start to value things more if you either price it right or advertise it right, or attract the kind of right people through people who actually value your stuff. So that's the best I could do for this question. So next question is from Kadar Kalambi 8768. Dude, that's a really long question. That's a whole video in itself. So I'm just gonna pick the most poignant one, which is the first one, which addresses academic reading, and I think it's the stuff that I'm comfortable talking about. Whereas the rest of the stuff, I'm not really qualified. I mean, the third one maybe is just way too long. We got a queue here happening, man. So, number 1, I was curious how academics read multiple books, which they cipher their texts. Do they read them cover to cover, or use fast reading techniques, which you once shared in a post? I would like to know more about these fast reading techniques. Also, which techniques academics use to get information from any book in their process of research. So yeah, academia and academic writing is a whole can of worms. So you're curious about how academics read multiple books, which they cite for their texts. In my experience, these fast reading techniques, this is not exactly what they do, but over time, throughout years of training and throughout years of kind of like picking up the right stuff to read and noticing certain patterns and noticing certain behavior of texts, they tend to zoom in on the important stuff really quickly. So from the outset, it might as well look like, yeah, if they've read the whole paper, 30-page paper in 10 minutes, but no, they've learned how to skim the unimportant parts and retain the important parts. And of course, if they're kind of like doing a research, realistically, they only need about 1 to 2 quotes. And if they're very familiar with the field, they can skim the rest of the paper. So the ultimate goal of learning how to read is to one day be able to slow down or speed up as you read through a text. It's not like a textbook standard of like, okay, you need to read fast on everything, or you need to read everything super slowly. But these super readers, and I started to develop some of these abilities as I was doing more research, especially when I was working on my thesis. You do tend to develop certain abilities, and one of these abilities is learning how to identify the crucially important parts. That's why sometimes academics, if they really need an argument from a book that they have read, they will just pick off that book from their shelves and they will reference the one sentence or the one page that's crucial for them to make an argument. So it might seem like they got like 6 books on their desks, but they've either read them before, or they've skimmed them before, or they just have learned how to really identify the right passages straight away to use as citation. Citation's a sneaky business. Sometimes you can really get away with just reading a page and getting what you need and abandon the rest of the paper, because there's a lot of fluffy academic writing. A lot of it is kind of addressing things that common readers don't really need to know. And of course, if you're experienced enough in a field, you can pick it up without reading the rest of it. But with that being said, if you're just getting into it, I would recommend you to read absolutely everything because you don't have the pattern recognition just yet. And I would say, yes, it's a skill level thing. As you advance your skill levels, which I'll teach you how to do in future videos, you will also learn how to identify the important parts of a text and how that text might be used for either citation or personal notes, and you're able to vary your reading speed, not just stay at some prescribed reading speed or some slow-ass reading speed just because you want to be better than everyone else. Thanks for the question, Kadar. Now moving on. Next question is from Dansun 98. I'm just gonna ignore the numbers. Dansun, Danyo-san. Hi Robin, what's the best way to choose the next book, intuition, mood, or a structured reading plan? How do experienced readers curate their TBRs and avoid decision fatigue? Cheers. I mean, the previous question sort of links to this one quite nicely, which is over time, the more sources you expose yourself to, and the more books you read, you start to kind of develop this spidery sense of like, okay, I think this is important, I don't think that's important, whereas when you first start, you want to read absolutely everything because you don't have that filtering mechanism. This is why I'm so critical of book recommendations, because it's like we all develop different filters. The more we read, we prefer one genre of reading over another. For example, when I first started reading, I read a lot of fiction, a lot of literature, but as I've gotten older, a lot of stuff in my life started falling apart, including parts of my health. It's not terrible, but nowadays I read mainly nonfiction. And like, how do I better parts of my life? Or I read a lot of journalism because I'm really interested to hear about the world in that way. So over time, don't be surprised if what you're looking for in books start to change. And with regards to decision fatigue only comes from you not really trusting your intuition, or you not really trusting the process that one day, yes, you get to be a pretty decisive judge because you're going to know what book is important for you and your life situation and what's not that good. And it's perfectly okay to abandon TBRs because sometimes the cover's pretty, but the book might be completely useless. So at that point, it's kind of stupid if you hold yourself hostage to a TBR. I've written about this on my newsletter. Don't let your TBR hold you hostage. And it's a free article. If I remember, I'll link to it in the description down below. Yes, but with practice and experience, you'll be able to find that intuition or mood. And yes, experienced readers are some of the most chaotic TBR people I've ever met. They will set up like a temporary TBR but completely abandon it the next week. And then maybe a few weeks later, they read something completely out of left field. You might catch this person reading a recipe book one day, or like the very next week, they jump on a wagon of reading, I don't know, existentialist philosophy. So they're all over the place. But one thing that they do have is that they're very clear about what they want out of a book and the kind of intuition that guides them to get the most out of it. And that's something you'll just develop over time the more you read. And of course, the best way to get there is to read more. Thanks for the question, Daniel-san. Next question. Oh, Michel Epaz. I don't know if this person's French, but Michel Epaz. Greetings. Oh, we have another cluster question, 3 questions. Greetings. I'm looking forward to your next video. Yes, this is the next video. If it's okay, I have 3 questions in mind that I'm having a crisis with. Again, I'm going to address one because there's a giant queue behind you right here. This is kind of like asking for stamps. You want 3 stamps, but, there's a queue. Everyone's trying to get into the club. So I think question 2 to 3, someone else also raised this question later on. So we'll get to these 2 questions in a question later on, but I'll just address the first one. Number 1, I know you already make a video about Sindoku, art of hoarding books, but you can make a new updated habit seeing how to stop hoarding, going on bookstore and actually reading them. I think you're asking how do you just basically stop buying new books without reading them? Well, I think my thinking around this topic has really changed over the past few years. Now I love buying books. I made the case before of like if you buy too many books, you're buying the consumption instead of buying to the knowledge. So I'd encourage you guys to kind of read the book at a bookstore, to figure it out, to see what it really really is all about before you buy it. But now, I am personally guilty of having so many books in a video backdrop that I'm like a terrible person to make an update video about this topic, because nowadays I think of books as wine. Not even wine. A really good beer could do the trick as well. What's a liquor that tastes better with age? Maybe a whiskey. Yeah, maybe it's whiskey. Whiskey is a better analogy because I hate wine. Essentially, if you go ahead and buy a really nice bottle of whiskey, it is kind of insane to assume that you're going to drink it that night. It's kind of insane to assume that, like, yes, this is not a special occasion, it's not my birthday, and I'm simply just going to sit down and drink myself to death on this couch right here. And the same thing is happening with books. Sometimes you never really know which book is going to slot into which chapter of your life. So I simply buy whatever interests me. And now I think in Readings, it's an Australian bookstore, they have a bargain table. And this whole bargain table, you can get like 3 books for like $20. It's insane. So what I do nowadays is I would go to this bargain table, I would kind of look at whatever tickles my fancy, and I would kind of like buy 2 to 3 books. Feels great. And sometimes I just simply store them on my bookshelf. And whenever I finish a book, I kind of browse my own bookshelf as if it's a bookstore. It's kind of a cool experience. And I sort of pick, what interests me. I'm currently reading Lost Connections by Johann Hari, something that I never expected myself to read, because I read his book Lost Focus and I enjoyed his writing style so much that I decided to pick this one up. And it's been sitting on my shelf for like 2-3 weeks, but recently I picked it up and now I can't put it down. So you never really know when a book is supposed to slot into your life. Just like, a bottle of whiskey that ages really well. You never really know when the right occasion is for you to break it out. But if you want to be a little bit more deliberate with your reading, I would personally get like a free Kindle app on your phone or something, or even just get a secondhand Kindle, because Amazon does not deserve any more money. If you really want an express way to really know what books you want to read, you can get any book. You can get a sample from any book from the Amazon store without paying these people a single cent. So you can essentially read the first 10% of a lot of books. So you can download all of them, read them, see if you like them. If you really like them, then do you go to the store to pick it up. So basically old advice, just slightly new technology. Moving on to the next one, Holy Scowl. These names are getting weirder and weirder. Advice for how to connect with people with similar reading interests as someone out of school and older. This is a really great question, because when you first start to read, reading kind of becomes your whole personality, and you only want to connect with people who read. You only want to connect with people who can kind of do these verbal kind of, I don't know, saxophone battles with you. You trade some notes of like something that you've read, and they say it back, and it's like this nice mutual language. But as I've gotten a little bit older, I started to realize that some of the deepest connections don't actually come from books alone. Of course, it helps to bridge a similar interest. If you're reading a very interesting book, well, you can kind of connect with another person who has read that book. But at the same time, the power of reading can extend beyond books. You can perfectly meet someone who doesn't read what you read, but they're in some adjacent field. They're interested in some adjacent subject. And when you bring this book up, it might really interest them. And you might introduce them to reading. So I think the older I get, the more I'm keen to diversify my interests and not merely constrict kind of like my interest groups and where I socialize, just purely limited to like a reading community. Because yes, it's harder to find these communities, and it's way easier to find overlaps, and also makes you a more curious person. I find a bunch of people from my dojo. Now, apparently I practice karate 3-4 times a week now. And some of these conversations with these people are absolutely fantastic. And sometimes I would recommend a book, and sometimes they will recommend something that I've never thought of, like a film or a novel that I've never heard of. And I go read it, and it's fantastic. So you never know what really is out there. And especially when you're out of school, diversifying your circles might just land you more interesting overlaps with different people compared to you just hunting for a really narrow sphere of the population who read what you read. That's kind of like a narrow scope. So diversify your interests. You never know who you're going to meet, and best of luck out there. and congrats on finishing school, and congrats on getting out of it, honestly. So next question is from Hikem or Hikem. It's just H.A. H.A. wants to ask, I'm struggling with publishing my first academic article in the field of literature, and I don't know where to start, especially in choosing the best literary theory. Well, this is right down my alley because, oh man, literary theory is kind of my guilty pleasure. I know I shouldn't talk about it on this channel because whenever I publish a video about literary theory, everyone just turns off. I get like 2,000 views on those videos. But anyway, given the permission today, literary theory is such a can of worms, and I'm just interested to see like what kind of field of literature are you in, and I'm curious to see why this obsession with theory, because theory can only get you so far. Because a part of the trouble that we're running into right now is that we're still recycling the theory from like the 1980s or even back to the 1960s. You know, that's when literary theory really started to bloom. So it's really easy to fit some of these theories into some of the readings that we have right now. If you just browse through any first-year papers, you know, given that they're not written by AI, well, you're going to see a lot of repeating patterns. You know, this is a deconstructive reading, or this is trying to sound post-structuralist, or this is trying to sound like a, I don't know, Foucauldian deconstruction. But over time, it gets so tiring. And of course, theory itself is running the academy, especially in literature, into the ground. So I would really be careful with choosing theory as your lens of interpretation, because you might run into something called paranoid reading, where you start to read the text through the lens of this theory. Granted, if you are trying to do exactly that to get your article published, I would choose a theory that personally resonate with you, because a lot of these theories, they are so difficult to get into. You know, even plummeting the depth of one theory could take you a year or two just to wrap your head around it. And, you know, it took me 5 years to wrap my head around like what Derrida was on about, because it requires so much like pre-reading of like Husserl, and after Husserl you got these nutcases like Heidegger that you have to read, and then, you know, after you get through all that stuff, you're already out of university. So I would go ahead and read some secondary reading on whatever theory that you're into, and just pick one, because there's just too many of them. There's no such thing as a best theory. All of them kind of attack or analyze texts from different frames of view, and the very conception of theory is that you can't read a text in multiple ways. This is kind of like one of the major arguments in postmodernism. So choose carefully and make sure you pick one that you're actually going to spend the time to study, because getting to know a theory from the ground up, it could take a lot of time, and it could take a lot of study. And of course, make sure not to run into the trap of paranoid reading. It's really annoying. And I've heard from professors who complain about this. It's really annoying to kind of read a text and you kind of know the theory behind it. You know, as the graphic designers say it, because my partner's a graphic designer, you can see the Pinterest board behind this piece of work. So you don't really want to do that. What you really do want to do is somehow take your own spin on a theory. You know, can you notice any inconsistency in the theory? And your professors are going to love you if you can point out the limitations of this theory when applied to a source text that you're analyzing. So I know that answer might sound like absolute Looney Tunes to you guys, but that's my that was my specialization. I got into theory, fell in love with theory, fell out of love with theory, and my thesis ended up being a thesis about anti-theory, about how to get beyond critique and theory. So anyway, different talk show. Ooh, Caesar Augustus wants to ask. Oh my God, we better take this one really seriously. Hi Robin, my question is simply, do I need to do this in a Roman accent? Aren't Romans Italians? Anyway, but I'm not going to offend Italians right here. My question is simply, how many hours a day do you spend / can speed reading? You know, that's some Roman, you know. Anyway, I'm gonna stop with a Caesar Augustus bullshit right here. My question is simply, how many hours a day do you spend reading or speed reading? No more than 2 hours. Yeah, it's just, I simply don't believe in that kind of where you have to put your whole life on hold just to read. If you read more than 3 hours, unless you're doing a literature course, it's not really necessary. And of course, I published a recent newsletter about this. It's free. Again, if I remember, I'll link it in the description down below, where I talk about basically you don't need more than 2 hours to get through an impressive amount of reading. Because if you really do the math, if you want to read 3 books a month, that's like 900 pages. 900 divided by 30, you get about 30 pages a day. How many hours do you realistically need to read 30 pages a day? Even with your slow-ass reading speed, maybe 1 to 2 hours. And if I really get into a book, maybe 2.5 hours. Because after that, my brain simply just gives up. And it's kind of delusional to think that you can still retain information after your maximum kind of mental bandwidth. So no more than 2 to 3 hours. And I don't speed read. As somewhat of a experienced reader, I know where to speed up and I know where to slow down, but I don't speed read a book. I think that's not the point. You learn to speed read to get through assignments, but afterwards, when you get to a place where you're like, I just want to sit around and enjoy a book. Why would I race through a book that I've been waiting for years? I want to savor it. I want to enjoy it. So I read pretty slowly, no more than 2 hours, and I still get through about 5 books a month, which is pretty good. Next question, Yoglerific. All these names, they sound like weird country names. I'm sure we can have kind of like we can build a tabletop game out of this, like a World Conquest table game out of all these names. Hi Robin, is there a way whilst reading to create mental notes to better remember what the previous chapters are about without needing to constantly restart from chapter 1? I tend to forget what the previous chapters were about when I pick up the book again, and I'll usually take a while before I recall. There's a strategy. I made a video about this. Refer back to the video. Field notes. These are the notes that you only take when you conceive an idea, when something makes sense to you. So you're not neurotically noting everything down, because in the long term, you'll never look at those notes ever again. I can tell you this from experience. If you take extensive notes, those notes are going to be useless. They're going to be clinical unless you're studying for a test. Maybe you can take long notes, but if you're just kind of like going through a book for personal pleasure or just for a personal research project, and of course another hack, which comes to us from inspectional reading, from Dr. Adler, which says that if you feel like you're forgetting something, just simply read the subheadings of a chapter if they have subheadings. If you're reading fiction, I think you just have to create some field notes. You just have to note down some key moments from a novel, and these field notes are supposed to be succinct, and they're supposed to take you back to that moment of discovery so that you associate this new idea with something that you already know. And yes, these notes are going to mean absolutely nothing to anyone else, but they might mean the world to you. So as you read, just have a little sticky note on the side, write in the margins if you have to, and have a legal pad on the side. Just sketch out some field notes. And when you return to it, these ideas are going to be a lot more potent, and it's going to be a lot easier for you to remember what had happened instead of just, flipping back to chapter 1. So that's what I would do. So check out the video on field notes if you want a little bit more direction. Oh my God, more difficult names. Kusharg. I'm not even going to try. 4581. Hi, Robin. My question is that if I'm reading a particular author and I'm used to their writing style, should I read all their work together so as to increase the speed and maintain the flow in which I am? Then again, this obsession with speed, I'm going to have to keep beating this. Okay, I'm not going to beat a horse. I'm going to have to keep beating this drum until it breaks. Reading, you might start from a speed incentive. And if you feel like you want to read another book by this author, yes, go ahead. And in fact, I do that. I read Johann Hari's Stolen Focus. I loved his style so much that I started reading his Lost Connections, even though the book is a little bit big and it's a little bit complicated. There's a lot of scientific research in there, which I normally would not read, but his writing style is so delightful. So I thought to myself, I like it. Let me read another one. But if you feel like it benefits you, and if you feel like you won't get bored, go ahead. Yes, it's going to be a lot easier for you to ease into another writer's writing style. But a part of me is also like, yeah, but isn't it more exciting for you to explore someone else's writing? Isn't it more exciting for you to I wonder what this is. I wonder what that is. Break it up a little bit and don't worry too much about speed. Like I said before, 30 pages a day, you can get to 900 pages a month, even with a slow-ass reading speed. So by default, if you're reading every single day, you're already reading pretty damn fast. So, there's always going to be more books that are going to be published. And I would even say, it's a greater tragedy to read a lot of books with no thinking behind those readings or with no applications. This book is not changing you in any way. So if this book by the similar or by the same authors benefiting you, and if they're giving you pleasure, well, stick with the author. But if not, feel free to switch, and don't worry about reading speed. You're already doing really well, so don't worry about it. So this question right here is a callback to the cluster question a few questions ago, which is Ella4571. How do you get over the fatigue? I want to read more, but not only do I have a terrible time focusing on one hung for too long, but I get so tired after only reading a page. It's like I have to have a nap just from a few paragraphs. What do I do? With regards to fatigue, I would really go ahead and question, first of all, the difficulty of your reading material. If you're not reading something for a class, sometimes we have this idea of like, there are books that we're supposed to read. These are great books. We're supposed to read all of them. Then again, this is why I have a bone to pick with recommendation culture. I think you need to read from a level where you're comfortable. Like, this is the level where I'm comfortable, and I'm gonna use this as my level to advance up. But a lot of people simply have too much pride. It's like, yes, deep down, I want to read this new Dan Brown novel, but my head is like, no, you need to be reading The Three Musketeers. So of course, you're gonna get tired because, unfortunately, reading is a skill. It's a muscle that needs to be built up. And I would just say, first of all, question the difficulty of your reading material. Are you reading it because you want to show off? Or if you're reading it for a class, choose easier material. And if it makes you fatigued, use an audiobook as an aid for all I care. And another important thing here to note is that, are you committing the scrapbooking mistake? So this is what I call the scrapbooking mistake, where you work on a few paragraphs and you want to extract everything from them, right? So you see a fact, you note the fact down. You see like a historical figure, you note the historical figure down. So over time, you end up with this kind of weird bazaar of random events with no seeming order. And that means you haven't done an inspectional reading. An inspectional reading, there's a second part of inspectional reading, which is called superficial skimming, where you would work through the entire text without ever stopping. And a lot of people have an aversion to this. It's like, I don't want to come back to this book again, so I might as well read it as hard as I can. But in practice, you're going to need 2 readings for most books. So instead of struggling or like really hating yourself through this one page and needing to go to sleep, either number one, find your difficulty level. Find something that's just a little bit above your comprehension level and work your way up. Or number 2, you're confusing the stages. Inspectional always comes before analytical. If you put the cart in front of the horse, you're going to get fatigued. And of course, the kind of knowledge that you're going to get from this reading experience is not going to be that good, because you don't even know what's happening amidst this plot of land, and you're already studying the birds. So it's kind of like you need the landscape before the details. So keep those 2 things in mind and find the solutions. And I hope that this is going to reduce some of your fatigue, because I know it's really tiring if you want to struggle against 2 pages of a really difficult text without having inspected it. So the next question, Hiranas6174, again, sorry if I butchered your name. I have a question: how can one get into books like philosophy and other classical reads and actually extract some wisdom from them? I feel intimidated even to start them. Well, intimidation, I'm actually going to write a whole separate post about this. Intimidation is something that you feel when you categorize a book into a category that it shouldn't be in. So there are certain intimidating books. It's as if they're not even written by human beings. They're too great for you. They're too awesome for your eyes. But, they're written by human beings. They might use different language, or their language might be a little bit stiff. Their language might be from a bygone era, but fundamentally, you need to go discover that sliver of humanity from all these intimidating books in them. And don't place yourself below these books, because these are just like people. If you read any literary biography, or like, biographies of philosophers, they all had pretty quirky lives, you're going to start to realize, yeah, people wrote these books. They had their idiosyncrasies. They had their faults. Yes, these books are very impressive. But at the end of the day, you're a human being. You can read them. And if you train yourself into a more competent reader, it simply becomes a matter of effort. And if you have this limiting belief of like, they're too big for me to start, they're too awesome for my taste, or they're holier than me, well, that's just going to hold you back from ever exposing a new avenue of knowledge, and you're going to be stuck forever. You're going to be stuck basically afraid to start any of these books. And another symptom of this is people reading around a book all the time. They read all the secondary material without tackling the main thing. I fell into this trap when I was in second year, but sometimes just diving to the water, or like just jumping in, the water's fine. It tends to create a more pleasant reading experience, and that's where you really get to stretch your comprehension muscles if you get over this hump. Because once you get over this hump, you're going to start to realize it's not that bad. It's not that difficult, and it is going to be difficult, but if I really try, and if you really give it a crack, give it a proper crack, you might find yourself having a lot more fun, because these are books written for humans to read. I don't know about certain philosophy books. They sound like they're written by lizard people, but if you can't understand it, consult some secondary sources. Just do what you can, because you can't let this fear hold you back forever. Because one day you're going to have to just jump in, and you might discover that you're going to have a great time doing it. And the first thing is, you got to get rid of that fear. So next question is from Hassan. Hi, Robin. What can you tell me about reading a text written in a non-native language? I'm an English literature student, and I speak English as a second language. I've read many books written in English, including important literary works such as Hamlet, Arms and the Man, Dr. Faustus. However, I can't stop feeling that I'm at a disadvantage as a non-native English speaker compared to those who study the same branch and speak English as a mother tongue. Also, there's this idea that I'm not getting the whole benefit of the book because of my limited linguistic skills. What's your opinion? Well, I'm going to be honest. This might be the most grammatically perfect comment I've ever read. You got full stops, you got capitalizations, and you got everything. So I would even say, dude, your English is fine. And also, in my experience, non-native speakers have this advantage that's not often talked about, which is if you learn it as a second language, you tend to pay a lot closer of an attention to the language itself. You're less prone to cliches. You can spot anomalies from a mile away, whereas people who are too close to the language, sometimes, they're prone to making more mistakes than you. It's like having a fresh pair of eyes on a different thing. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. And given this comment, God, I really appreciate a well constructed and well composed comment full of all the right punctuations and everything, capitalizations. I wouldn't worry about it as long as you keep expanding all the skills that you've learned from your degree, and as long as you keep reading. And from what I can see so far, yes. In fact, if you think you're not reaching some secret level that native speakers are reaching, well, not really. It's just everyone's kind of starting from the same playing field with literature, because some of these pieces of literature that they're so difficult to read, they might as well be in a foreign language. So anyway, thanks for the question. Next one is from Ionic Compound. One of the first easy to say names ever. I'm not trying to flex, I swear, but I naturally read pretty fast. Do you think that might hinder my ability to process information at a deep level? Then again, good on you for reading pretty fast. What I would say to that is practice varied reading speeds, because there's certain books, when it comes down to a very information dense chunk, you might have to slow down. And the danger here is to adopt this kind of universal reading speed, so you gloss over the important parts and kind of skim through the wrong parts and then slow down at the wrong parts. This is something that you just have to practice. Sometimes you're able to spot a long paragraph with a lot of information, and that's probably when you need to slow down if you don't want to miss anything. So yeah, fast reading speed, really good. That means you have really good comprehension, but if there's a information chunk, make sure to practice varied reading speed, so you're not subscribing to a uniform speed that might cause you to miss certain bits from this piece of reading. We got one more question. Holy heck. Last question is from Raza Melgani. I always look forward to your videos. Thank you very much. Wednesday evenings are for Waldun. Thank you so much. I'm honored to take up your Wednesday evening. My question, suppose a person is interested in Paradise Lost. Should he go and read all the other authors / book who heavily influenced Milton, like Dante's Divine Comedy or Bible, or should we read them after having read Paradise Lost? This is something you understand. The minute you dive into a primary text, it's never a good idea to read supplementary material first before you dive into a piece of reading. I see a lot of people doing this with a lot of primary texts. Instead of just reading the text yourself and draw your own conclusions, and then maybe compare your conclusions to the author's influences, there's this instinctive kind of like knee-jerk reaction of like, I need to get this right. You know, when you read a poem for the first time, I better read all the secondary readings around this poem before I read a poem myself. But then again, you're kind of imposing understanding on this poem. But the best policy is always just to get in there. You might not understand it. You might have a difficult time working through the book. It's just kind of like if you want to dig through all the influences, you're not really doing literature. You're doing philology, or you're a historian. You know, it makes sense for a historian, but just as someone who really wants to read, train up your reading abilities to the point where you're able to entertain some of these uncomfortable feelings. You know, I think John Keats had a term for this, which is called negative capability, because we're so used to wide awake language. We want everything to be rendered into either academic speak or rendered in a blog post, so we don't really have to do any of that struggle with the uncertainty or the uncomfortable feeling of contending with new words and new expressions. Or if you're dealing with older novels, you don't want to contend with that uncertainty of like, you know, am I getting this right? But that uncertainty is what most of literary studies is founded upon. It's just people coming up with interesting interpretations. You know, you might miss the mark, but that's kind of the point. And as you bounce around these interpretations and as you read the main author's influences, you'll piece together a more holistic picture. So that whole archaeological / historical dive where you're going to get into the web of like who influenced whom, the building of that timeline should come after the fact or after you've read the book, not before, because you're going to have a gaping hole. And this hole can only be filled by embracing it because unfortunately, academia has set up these impossible standards. They always pretend that they know these books better than everyone else, but then you actually go read these books with them, they have no idea. You know, they're coming with educated guesses. Yes, they have more theory, but that doesn't mean you can't take something away from this piece of work yourself. And at some point, you'd have to contend with that uncertainty and fear. And once you get over it, reading becomes a lot more fun. And that's my answer to this question. Just have fun, get into it, and I'll see you on the other side. Oh my gosh, so that was 17 questions, and that concludes this Q&A. And I'm very tempted to make an entire series out of this, so I might post another question thread next week to answer some of your reading questions, but I might keep it short. I might not record another 50-minute episode because it's a kind of a pain in the ass to edit, and also a pain in the ass it's really hard on my voice. You know, this is the first day that I got my voice back, and I think now it's threatening to throw itself off a cliff again. But anyway, thank you for watching this week's episode of Coffee Wednesday. I really look forward to producing these episodes, and I am really happy to be here every Wednesday to chat about different ways to bring back the pleasure, as well as the magic of reading and self-education into your life. Robin Waldun here. I'll see you back here next Wednesday. Take care, and goodbye.